And I was introduced to Guy Debord, Mr. Situationist, Raoul van Agem, his lieutenant, who wrote perhaps some of the most effective works of the Situationists, such as the everyday life thing, to use a Bushism, and Mustafa Kayati, who was the Muslim Situationist who seemed anxious to join the Fedayeen in the Middle East. And we spent a good deal of time together. But then strange rashes began to appear. First of all, they explained to me that there were a number of people whom they had expelled, who I met in the course of living for a period of time in Paris, and that these people were people you could not talk to. You couldn't talk to them. They became non-persons. And I found that to be disgusting. I found that to be irrational, anti-human, totalitarian. I found it to be Stalinist. And I could not understand that policy, and I objected to that. I never became a situationist. And then there were other questions. They thought that ecology was ridiculous. They called it zoology, contemptuously. But they seemed to tolerate it because they did want to win me, frankly. And they wanted me to be, as much as possible, somewhat of a representative of situationism in the United States, an honor and distinction that I refused. But we left on cordial terms. There were also certain attributes, very self-serving. Claims were made that they had influences on movements that I knew they absolutely didn't have. They claimed to influence the Japanese student movement called the Zengakurin, which is a very, very militant student movement, incredibly, confrontational, even violent. They claimed to have an influence on the provost in Amsterdam. This is magnificent history that should never be forgotten, which I knew to be anarchist, because I went up to Amsterdam and I spoke to one of the people who helped form the provost, named after the proletariat, as they used to call themselves, and more precisely, provo in the sense of provoke. Not provoke violently, but engage in happenings which were extremely inventive and ingenious. One example is when they ran through the streets giving out a leaflet. When you picked up the leaflet, it said, "Write your own leaflet." That sort of stuff. A very artistic movement. And the leader, or I shouldn't say that they had any leaders, but the most influential person among them, Raoul van Dien, was long since departed from these principles, I guess. The last time I heard was that he was somehow or other connected with the Dutch government or a Dutch corporation. I can't tell you what their future is, really. Was a Bookchinist. He was his father had been a hard-line Dutch anarchist, and anarchism has a very strong influence in Holland or in the Netherlands. It has a long tradition there, going back to the 19th century. And so I knew that I had no influence on them, on any of these groups, at least certainly those that I encountered. When I spoke to Van Dien, he amusingly said the Situationists came around, gave him an ultimatum. Be or not to be, so to speak. And this authoritarianism was shocking to me. And it was very clear to me that there were mainly two people, and principally one person, Mr. Guy Debord. When I went back toward the end of the May-June events in '68, during the student and worker uprising to France, I tried to find out what the Situationists did. Well, I ultimately found out that they got disgusted with the movement. They were that way. They got disgusted with the movement when they couldn't control it or influence it. Although they did exercise a certain amount of influence in the imaginative slogans that they generated. I don't know that they made up these slogans, but they created the ambiance that fostered these slogans like imagination to power, be realistic, do the impossible. Now, these are not situationist slogans. These were improvised by anarchists and anarchist-guided students who were waving black flags. I must emphasize that there were almost as many black flags being raised in May, June as there were red flags. And on the Yodian, the two flags were crossed together, a black and a red flag. And I recall these things. This was made up by the aesthetic tendencies that existed among anarchic youth, basically much more influenced by anarchism than by situationism. Although situationism played its role. But the situationists, the Guy Debord and the like, retreated into the Beaux-Arts and started making their own posters. And the posters were not artistic. The posters were slogans. Form workers' councils. Workers, form your own councils. Well, I'll tell you, having thoroughly studied 68, I could write a history of that very easily. Having seen 68, at least toward the end, having been tear-gassed by the CRS, that is the police out there, the mobile police that the French use, I can tell you that if workers' councils were established in 68, it would be dominated by the Communist Party. Because the French workers, well-meaning, spontaneous, and everything, were still members, for the most part, of the communist-controlled CGT, the General Confederation of Labor, or workers. And the CGT would have dominated these councils and would have betrayed these councils, just as the German Social Democrats in 1918 dominated, the majoritarian pro-government Social Democrats dominated the German soldiers and workers' councils, such that even Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, two of the greatest figures of German revolutionary history, couldn't even become members, weren't even elected to the Congress of the workers' councils that was held, essentially, which dissolved itself. So their strategy was crazy, to begin with. Their practice was far too redolent of what I had seen in the communist movement. They were not part of the New Left. They were really part of an aesthetic element in the New Left, and they were not even in the New Left. They were more in the French artistic tradition. They had borrowed many of their ideas with no acknowledgement. In fact, they felt that plagiarism was something which everyone was entitled to engage in. However, if they were plagiarized, or they thought something resembling their point of view was used by anyone else, they would put up posters over Paris denouncing whoever took anything from them. And very frequently, what they thought was taken from them, they had borrowed from somebody else. So let me tell you frankly, it was a very colorful, often in some areas, primarily in aesthetics, seemingly creative, but really in many respects a very, how shall I put it, Jacobin type of movement. And I think that they would have killed their expelled members if they had the authority or they had the power to do so. And I think that this is an aspect of situationist history that should not be forgotten. I think that they were manipulative, particularly Debord. I think that they were unscrupulous, particularly Debord. They managed to get hold of a publishing house, Champs Libres, and excluded certain people from being published, whom the publisher originally thought of publishing because it did not conform to their line, or they had a personal grudge. And personal grudges counted enormously. They were very much an ad hominem type of movement, and they tended to slander all over the place. They should have been quite open and said how much they took from Lefebvre. Lefebvre was the first of the French Marxists. Indeed, it's hard to really characterize him, strictly speaking, as a Marxist who emphasized everyday life. He is famous for a 2-volume work that I understand already 1 volume of which has been translated, and emphasizing le quotidien. They took that from him. They weren't original. And I would see excerpts from André Breton's works, which they borrowed wholesale, without quotation marks. I don't mind that. That's fine with me. Don't give attribution. But don't become resentful and put up posters, say, when somebody happens to use what they thought were their very original ideas. I think they were mostly a style. That's what they really were, a style. In terms of ideas, not very original. In terms of the spectacle, that was known already. We knew about it. We had different words for it. We called it the consumer society, the commodity society. Okay, their spectacularism. I like to put it this way. If they claim to have invented the theory of the spectacle, I would say that they were the spectacle of theory. That's about all I have to say at the moment.